Two empires, two systems, both horrific, but built on very different rules. In ancient Rome, slavery was an everyday norm, essential to the rich and embedded in family life. But in America, it became a radicalized engine for profit, brutal, dehumanizing, and lifelong. On today's episode of the Infographic Show, we're looking at Roman slavery versus American slavery. How different were they? At the height of the Roman Empire, an estimated 10 to 20% of the population was enslaved. With around 50 to 60 million people living under Roman rule, that meant roughly 5 to 12 million were enslaved. However, some historians argue the number may have peaked as high as 15 million during Rome's most aggressive years of conquest. The Roman Empire stretched from Hadrian's Wall in northern England all the way to present-day Iraq, a massive expanse of land to put slaves to work. But despite the empire's size, most enslaved people lived in urban areas, particularly in what is now Italy. Many worked on the vast estates, or latifundia, owned by the wealthy elite. Slaves accompanied legions on foreign campaigns but were rarely armed as fighters. Military service was tied to citizenship, and arming enslaved people whose families you might have murdered was too risky. But slaves were indispensable on campaign. They would act as camp servants, hauling supplies, cooking, digging fortifications, tending to animals, and digging trench latrines. Still, in moments of extreme crisis, Rome did sometimes promise freedom to slaves who were willing to take up arms, just as thousands of black slaves would fight for the South in the American Civil War. But let's not jump ahead of ourselves. When you picture a Roman slave, many think of someone who worked to death under the lash, forced to gladiatorial combat or prostitution. While that grim reality was very real, Roman slavery was incredibly diverse, and not just in terms of what they did. They were taken from Italy, usually through debts or punishment, but also from Greece, Britain, Asia Minor, Gaul, Germania, and what we call the Balkans in Eastern Europe. They had different skin tones, hailing from Syria in Judea and today's Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, and Egypt. Some slaves performed manual labor under constant threat of violence, while others held skilled positions. They served as teachers, accountants, or even managed other slaves. Slavery wasn't viewed as immoral, possibly not even by the slaves. After all, in their country, there would have been slaves too. For instance, ancient tribes in today's Britain had slaves. Slavery was a global institution, not a fiendish black market enterprise shrouded in criticism. So they were literally everywhere in Roman society. In the fields, the cities, the baths, the markets, the military camps, even in state administration, Rome simply could not have functioned without them. The wealthy collected them like baseball cards as a symbol of their high status. The more slaves you owned, the higher you climbed on the social ladder. Some elite households owned hundreds, even thousands, some for the fields and some prized for their talents or specialized knowledge. The Roman state itself relied heavily on slaves. In the 1st century CE, around 700 slaves were employed just to maintain Rome's aqueduct system. Their wages paid out of public funds. Slaves maintained the sewer system. Most Romans weren't rich enough to have a private toilet, so they emptied their guts into one of the communal public latrines, wiping with a shared sponge. These public slaves likely had it worse than the household slaves. Some may have worked as nightmen or waste collectors, pushing cartloads of excavated Roman poop beyond the city walls every night. Without them, Rome would soon have been overcome with stink and disease, showing that without slaves, society just wouldn't have functioned. Slave prices varied. A skilled or moderately skilled slave could fetch around 2,000 sesterces in the first 3 centuries CE. To better understand that, a Roman legionary in the 1st century CE earned up to 900 sesterces a year. But much of this was deducted for food, clothing, and equipment, so he likely came out with 600. Hence, slaves weren't cheap at all. Nonetheless, a centurion, commanding a century of soldiers, earned 15 to 20 times that amount, enough to purchase several slaves. Still, like slavery in the US many years later, Roman slave owning was mostly for the well-off people and elites. Wealthy senators, successful merchants, and landowners could own dozens or even hundreds, using their human property to farm vast estates or run profitable enterprises. With slaves, you often speculated to accumulate. They could be a great investment. Not all Roman slaves were treated cruelly. Many Roman children grew up alongside household slaves, some of whom were highly educated and respected for their expertise. Freedmen, former slaves, often maintained ties of loyalty and friendship with their old masters, sometimes even rising to wealth and influence themselves. But make no mistake, slaves had no legal rights. They could not legally marry, own property, or bring a case to court. A slave was a thing, like livestock. A master could lend, sell, beat, or kill a slave with near total impunity for most of Roman history. If a slave killed a master, Roman law sometimes mandated collective punishment. Every slave under the roof could be interrogated, tortured, or executed as a deterrent. Even in relatively good households, a slave's security depended entirely on the whims of his or her owners. Some slaves were quite literally worked to death. Despite being valuable investments, the labor was often so brutal that survival was secondary to profit. According to the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, slaves in Roman mines made their masters' fortunes but often died from the exhaustion. He wrote, "They themselves wear out their bodies both by day and by night in the diggings under the earth, dying in large numbers because of the exceptional hardships, compelled beneath blows of the overseers." But evidence shows the Romans were careful not to push their slaves too far. And that was for one crucial reason: fear of revolt. After all, no master wanted to sleep under the same roof or eat food prepared by someone who secretly wanted them dead. The philosopher Seneca wrote, "It is creditable to a man to keep within reasonable bounds in his treatment of his slaves, believing even prisoners of war and slaves didn't deserve to be treated as animals." Slaves usually worked quietly in the background, cooking, cleaning, and often enduring advances from lustful masters or mistresses. At rich Roman banquets, slaves could be shared amongst the guests, and they had no choice. They were property. Abuse laws didn't cover them. Rome also had a thriving sex trade. Brothels operated openly, and men of all classes visited prostitutes without social stigma. Sleeping with a slave prostitute didn't count as adultery under Roman law. The crime only applied if a man had sex with a married, freeborn woman. Female clients were rarer, though satirists hinted wealthy women sometimes enjoyed their male slaves. High-class call girls or meretrix also existed. A session could cost around twice a laborer's daily wage, and most of the money went to the brothel owner or the pimp, making attractive slave prostitutes a lucrative business. We'll soon return to Roman daily life, but let's introduce American slavery. Enslavement in Africa goes back long before Europeans got involved. As far back as 1000 BCE, the trans-Saharan trade networks were moving captives from the West and Central Africa. After the Arab conquests of North Africa in the 7th century CE, this trade expanded massively. Muslim slave merchants transported enslaved Africans across the Sahara and the Indian Ocean, sending them as far as India, Java, and even China. By the 10th to 13th centuries, hundreds of thousands of Africans were enslaved in the Middle East and North Africa. Many men were castrated and forced into service as eunuchs. Women were trafficked into harems or pressed into domestic labor. Historians estimate that around 10 to 18 million Africans were taken eastward over the centuries, a vast trade that would later run parallel to the Atlantic trade. From the 1500s to the 1800s, North African raiders abducted between 1 and 1.25 million Europeans, even seizing children from coastal towns in southern England. When Mansa Musa, the emperor of Mali, made his pilgrimage to Mecca in the 14th century, it's said he brought with him 14,000 enslaved young women, though that number is debated by some historians. Then, in the 15th century, Europeans began trading sub-Saharan African slaves. By 1448, the Portuguese had already purchased around 1,000 enslaved Africans, sending them to Madeira and the Azores for early sugar plantations. Much of this trade relied on African intermediaries. Powerful kingdoms and coastal rulers captured or purchased captives from inland raids and sold them to European merchants. By the late 1400s, Portuguese traders, including some Lonçaros, those married to Africans, had established posts along the West African coast, creating the foundations of a massive transcontinental industry. Soon the Spanish, the Dutch, British, and French joined in, sending ships regularly to Africa to buy captives for transport across the Atlantic. The journey to the Americas, the Middle Passage, was a living nightmare. Captives were chained, starved, crammed into filthy holds, and exposed to disease for weeks at sea. Between 10 and 20% died en route, meaning that out of the 12.5 million Africans forcibly shipped across the Atlantic, about 1.8 million perished before they even reached the shore. Some jumped overboard thinking death was better than a life of brutal bondage. At 20 to 30 pounds a slave, death and jumping could get expensive for traders. The Portuguese were the largest traffickers, responsible for an estimated 5.8 million captives, mostly sent to Brazil. The British followed, transporting an estimated 3.2 million enslaved people during the transatlantic slave trade. Of those, 2.2 million were sent to the Caribbean colonies, while around 265,000 were brought to North America. According to the Slave Voyages database, the U.S. itself would take over 305,000 from Africa. But by 1860, after generations were born into slavery, the African American population had grown to 4.4 million, and around 3.95 million were enslaved. That meant that over 10% of the U.S. population, then 31 million, lived in bondage. Britain passed the Slave Trade Act in 1807 banning the transatlantic trade, but slavery itself remained legal in its empire until the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, which freed enslaved people. Britain paid 20 million pounds to slave owners, not the enslaved. The U.S. ended slavery in 1865 with the 13th Amendment, but as W.E.B. Du Bois later wrote in his book Black Reconstruction in America, this marked the beginning of a new era of oppression in the South. Freed people faced black codes, racial terror, and systemic disenfranchisement, ensuring they remained at the bottom of the social order. It's often said that the first African slaves arrived in the future USA in 1619. A Dutch privateer seized 20 to 30 Angolan captives from a Portuguese slaver and subsequently sold them to English colonists at Jamestown. But Africans had been enslaved in the Americas earlier. The Spanish transported enslaved Africans to their Caribbean colonies and also present-day Florida in 1565. The 1619 Angolans were recorded as indentured servants, not slaves, much like poor Europeans already toiling on plantations in Virginia. These new Africans were put to work on tobacco farms, which the Virginia Company of London had established 12 years earlier. Like the white indentured servants, they were commodities, abducted objects to be used in brutal forced labor. Today we recognize them as the first U.S. slaves, but it's more complicated than that. In the same year, another shipment landed, a group described in colonial records as Society's Sweepings. These were children from England, destitute kids, aged 8 to 16, many snatched straight from the streets. Torn from their families, they were packed onto ships and sent to the colonies to toil. Most would die within a few years from disease, malnutrition, violence, or exhaustion. Was this slavery? In 2008, NPR ran an article titled America's First Slaves, Whites, citing research from the book White Cargo, The Forgotten History of Britain's White Slaves in America. The book makes a strong case that while not perpetual or radicalized like African slavery would become, this early system was slavery in all but name. It laid the groundwork for racial slavery, and as you'll soon see, even racism. The main difference was that a proportion of these people technically had contracts promising freedom after 3 to 7 years. For that reason, they were cheap, but the system could be cheated by Virginia's elites. Between 300,000 and 500,000 British and Irish people were sent to the colonies over roughly 150 years as so-called indentured servants, many unwillingly. Ship records listed them as cargo alongside livestock and supplies. About 30% died on the voyage and another 40% in bondage, leaving only a fraction surviving. The myth that they chose servitude is only partly true. While some signed under economic desperation, many were duped, coerced, forced, or outright kidnapped. Around 20% were forced there directly from prisons. Petty thieves, vagrants, political dissidents, gypsies, prostitutes, and, quote, anyone else who displeased the upper classes. Tens of thousands of children were taken, many spirited away, meaning stolen off the streets by press gangs. Just one of these traffickers, the spirit named William Tiene, kidnapped 840 kids from Britain in a single year. An article on the process stated, children arriving without indentures could face much longer terms of service. Women servants often faced sexual violence. Some were sent specifically to breed children, boosting future labor supplies. If a child was born to a servant, whether from abuse or not, it was bound to serve until at least age 21, ensuring planters had a next generation of free labor. In the Virginia law against fornication, it stated that if a woman became pregnant, her master had to pay a fine. If he didn't, she was whipped. In 1662, a new law said that if her master made her pregnant, after she finished her contract, she had to be sold to the parish for another 2 years for the time lost in pregnancy. In 1691, a new law said, if a white servant had a child with a black male, she will have 5 years added to her service, and the child will be indentured for 30 years. Complaints of violence or sexual abuse were nearly always ignored by colonial courts. Beatings were routine. One horrific case is that of Elizabeth Abbott, abducted from England. After repeated escape attempts, her master whipped her 500 times, killing her. Nobody was charged. Records say that from the shipment she arrived with 300 children, only 12 survived over 2 years. Out of 5,000 servants arriving in one colony between 1670 and 1680, only 241 ever became landowners. Most, around 3,500, died before completing their contract. If a master died, servants were passed along as debts or property, listed in wills alongside livestock and tobacco. Many indentured servants described their condition as slavery for a term, but knowing many never lived long enough to see freedom. Contemporaries saw servants as slaves too. The Dutch trader David Pietersz de Vries remarked that English planters gambled away their servants at card games, treating human lives as poker chips. He said planters often worked them to death. To a cold-blooded businessman, it made sense to grind down a temporary worker and replace him with another cheap body. Indentured servants were supposed to have basic rights, but records show these were mostly fiction. Colonial courts almost always sided with the planters if there were complaints of abuse. Contracts could be extended on trumped-up charges, breaking a tool, talking back, or falling ill. Idleness or insubordination often ended in chains, mutilation, or branding. Some had their ears clipped or bore scars from savage whippings. So, was this slavery? By any modern standard, yes, it was a form of slavery. It wasn't perpetual or radicalized like African slavery would become, but for many, even back then, it was slavery in all but name. White servants were still toiling away as Africans began to arrive in greater numbers. They were listed as indentured servants and, like the whites, could finish their contract. Some, like Anthony Johnson, earned freedom, even himself owning servants later. But he was a very rare case. The laws were about to change. In 1662, hereditary slavery was codified. In 1664, Maryland law stated all Africans and their descendants were slaves for life. In 1669, Virginia law, an act about the casual killing of slaves, declared that if a slave died during punishment, it wouldn't be treated as a felony. It effectively legalized the killing of enslaved black people, something never codified for white servants. There was also John Punch, sentenced to life servitude in 1640 for running away, a punishment white servants didn't face. In fact, he was the first person sentenced to perpetual slavery. Meanwhile, the Dutchmen and Scotsmen that he'd run away with had 4 years added to their servitude. The blacks and whites might have worked together, but now the landowners were writing wicked laws that would change everything. Solidarity sometimes bloomed between black slaves and white servants. Records tell of them running away together, sharing food, hiding in the forests, and even plotting rebellion. When they did run away, there would be ads in newspapers, such as the plantation runaways who appeared in an ad in the Maryland Gazette on August 20, 1761. The owner was offering a 40-shilling reward for the capture of these 4 black runaways. On April 23, 1775, in the Virginia Gazette, the same man was offering $40 for the capture of the 2 white runaways, a young Scot and an Englishman. Both ads were written and signed by the same man, George Washington. In 1663, in Gloucester County, 9 servants, angry about not getting enough food, planned to arm themselves and march on the governor's house and demand their freedom. Someone snitched, and before the date even arrived, they were arrested. 4 were hanged. The snitch was given his freedom and 5,000 pounds of tobacco, although he had to compensate the master for the time off. The most famous uprising, Bacon's Rebellion, saw poor whites, black slaves, and free blacks rise up against the ruling class. They nearly toppled the elite, terrifying planters not only for the violence, but because it revealed a dangerous truth. The underclass, if united, could challenge the entire system. The reaction from wealthy Virginians was ruthless. Lawmakers began hard-coding racial distinctions, granting poor whites small privileges, easing punishments for them, and spreading the idea that freedom was a racial entitlement, not a universal right. This divide-and-rule strategy split potential allies apart, creating a racial hierarchy that distracted poor whites from their own exploitation while propagating racism against blacks. In 1705's Virginia slave codes, legal loopholes were closed to prevent any black slave ever becoming free. They became property, barely viewed as human, while poor white servants viewed their own privilege as rooted in skin color. Many years later, W.E.B. Du Bois argued that the same divide-and-rule tactics were still at work in the post-slavery South. In Black Reconstruction in America, he described how the Southern elite built a psychological wage for poor whites, an illusion of status over black workers, stoking fear and hatred to stop unity. It drove racism and protected the slave-owning class from serious criticism. We'll come back to African slavery soon, but first let's look at more details about the Roman slave. Roman slaves had no protection from cruelty. If someone injured or killed another man's slave, the victim legally was not the enslaved person, but his owner. who could claim damages. Even in assault cases, it was not the violated slave who had the standing, but the master whose property had been dishonored. Still, over the centuries, a glimmer of legal protection began to creep in. The most significant shift came under Emperor Constantine in 319 CE, when an imperial rescript declared a master who intentionally killed a slave, whether by beating, burning, or torture, could be charged with murder. It sounds obvious now, but this was a radical idea in Roman law. Killing a slave could be considered murder of a human being, not just destruction of property. For most of Roman history, such protections were non-existent. Under Nero, when a slave attacked his owner, 400 were put to death. Slaves were regularly tortured, executed by beasts in the arena, crucified, or burned. These were the worst cases, but slave experiences varied. A slave could be born in servitude, raised in a household, or taken as spoils of war and sold at auction. Sellers sometimes concealed illnesses, so cautious buyers brought physicians to inspect the merchandise. If not bought for their bodies, they were bought for their brains. A clever or educated slave might earn his owner a fortune, sometimes even managing businesses and making significant financial decisions. The law allowed them to keep a personal fund, a peculium, which they could use to buy freedom if the master agreed to sell. Roman households had specialized slaves for nearly every function: bakers, cooks, confectioners, porters, bedroom attendants, little bearers, and literary slaves who acted as readers, scribes, and copyists. Some highly skilled slaves were more valuable and more likely to be manumitted or made free. Working hours depended entirely on the master. Some slaves had tolerable conditions in households where owners weren't tyrannical or lustful. Public holidays might bring occasional rest days, but the essence of slavery was dehumanizing, and punishments for mistakes could be horrific. Some wealthy women were notoriously brutal to female slaves, beating them savagely for minor errors. Evidence from slaves themselves is rare, but Roman historians mention maltreatment. Rebellions, self-harm, and frequent runaway attempts hint at the misery many endured. Some deliberately broke tools or made mistakes just to assert some autonomy, often ending in beatings. Punishments ranged from whippings with rods or whips to branding runaways on the forehead. Some were chained for farm labor or humiliated with the furca, a heavy wooden yoke carried through the streets. Slaves didn't wear a uniform and blended in with the poorest free citizens. The Senate once proposed marking them with a distinctive clothing, but abandoned the idea for fear that slaves would realize their numbers and rebel. Life in the countryside or the mines was brutal and often short. The historian Diodorus Siculus wrote that quarry slaves would rather be dead than alive, with life expectancy sometimes only months, so it was often a punishment. For educated city slaves with decent masters, manumission was realistic. Estimates suggest 20% were freed, possibly more in the cities. Freedom could be earned, saved for, or granted as an owner's gesture of virtue. Some freed men became heirs, will executors, even wealthy citizens. Slavery was always dehumanizing, but life ranged from unbearable to comparatively privileged. The gap between a slave accountant in a patrician household and a chained quarry worker was vast. Freedom cost whatever the slave was worth. A skilled doctor or intellectual might cost 4,000 to 8,000 sesterces, with some fetching more than 10,000 if renowned for beauty or talents. The physician Galen trained enslaved doctors. Cicero's secretary was a slave, as was the storyteller Aesop. Rarely, sex slaves could buy freedom, like Vibia Calibi, who later managed a brothel as a freedwoman. A tough, strong male who looked or proved he could fight could win his owner's respect in the gladiatorial arena. The best specimens could cost between 3,000 to 8,000 sesterces. The very best as much as 12 to 15,000. If a gladiator won many fights and pleased his owner, he could win freedom, symbolized by a wooden sword, the rudis. They rarely bought freedom themselves, lacking the money. Flama, a Syrian gladiator, famously won his freedom 4 times but kept fighting. He fought 34 times, winning 21 before dying aged 30 after a trident pierced his neck. Old for a gladiator, most of them died in their 20s. If slaves did buy their freedom, Rome imposed few limits on what they could achieve. Freedmen held low status but could amass wealth and property. Some gained powerful positions, and while they couldn't hold political office, their children could. Romans obsessed over birthrights, but upward mobility was possible. In the US, plantation slaves were closer to Roman field or quarry slaves, sometimes household slaves, but certainly not doctors or scribes. They could sometimes purchase freedom if the owners allowed it. In 1839 Cincinnati, 42% of free blacks had self-purchased. Many tried to free relatives. like Venture Smith, captured in Africa, sold for 4 gallons of rum and calico, enslaved across Barbados, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. In 1765, he bought freedom for 71 pounds and 2 shillings and later purchased his wife, son, and 2 daughters. He paid $200 each for his sons, 40 pounds for his wife, and he even purchased a slave himself, who ran away. Freedom could also be granted in wills. In parts of the South near the Revolutionary era, this helped increase the free black populations from less than 1% to about 10% by 1810. Field labor was brutal, often 15 to 16 hours daily. Slaves worked cotton, rice, tobacco, sugar, or trades like carpentry, tailoring, driving, and domestic service. By the 1850s, nearly 500,000 worked in cities and factories, quarries, shipyards, or building infrastructure. Violence was constant, prosecutions rare. In some states, there were laws against cruelty, and as time went on, it was supposed to be illegal to kill your slave. But in truth, owners could use loopholes to get away with cruelty. In Louisiana, the 1806 Black Code stated, "The slave is entirely subject to the will of his master, who may correct him and chastise him, though not with unusual rigor, nor so as to maim or mutilate him, or to cause his death." For cruelty, the law imposed fines of $200 to $500, but flogging or striking with a whip, leather thong, switch, or small stick was explicitly permitted. In practice, you could easily get away with murder. Slaves couldn't testify in court, meaning a white witness was required if a slave was killed. Worse, an owner could escape punishment simply by his own oath, swearing innocence, and then walking free. One case involved North Carolina Judge Thomas Ruffin, who refused to charge an owner for assault and battery, declaring the beating necessary to render the submission of the slave perfect. Very few cases ever went to court, and even if they did, it was almost impossible for the slave to win. While a few owners were prosecuted, sentences were lenient. The Rapides Parish District Court convicted Joseph Populus of stabbing a slave to death, but the jury recommended mercy. The judge handed down only 12 months of hard labor. In St. Martin Parish, a jury found George White and Clarence Ward guilty of inflicting inhuman and cruel treatment on a slave who died from his injuries. Each was fined $400 and even had the audacity to appeal, though the conviction was upheld. When W.H. Davis was accused of deliberately shooting a slave, his defense argued that killing a slave, considered property, was not illegal. Local courts agreed, but the state Supreme Court overturned it, stating slaves are treated in our law as property and also as persons. But owners continually got away with brutal violence and murder. When a man shot and blinded a slave named John Hall, his owner S.D. McCutcheon sued the shooter, claiming his property was now useless. The injured slave had merely been, quote, lurking about a chicken house, yet the court awarded McCutcheon $1,500 in damages for lost property value. The shooter faced no personal penalty. The fact was, owners routinely escaped punishment for sadism and downright murder. Slaves were chained, collared, whipped, branded, and mutilated. And this was common. Ads for runaways noted disfigurements like little toe of each foot is off, or toes of both feet burnt off. One document described a man murdered in a spiked casket, his body turned into perfect mincemeat. Others died under lashes, their lives ending in sanctioned brutality. Frederick Douglass wrote of his Aunt Hester, whipped until blood pooled on the ground. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped. Records show how many were whipped for days, left unconscious, bled to death, or died from untreated wounds. Due to this extreme violence, and something we'll talk about soon, rebellions were rare. Nat Turner's 1831 rebellion in Virginia killed 55 to 65 whites. Mobs retaliated, murdering as many as 120 slaves and free blacks. Authorities executed 56, some not even involved. It was horrendous, a brutal message sent to anyone who might consider revolt. This wasn't Rome. Politicians were also always fighting about slavery. On May 22, 1856, abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner was nearly beaten to death on the Senate floor for an insult and an anti-slavery speech. The attacker, Democratic Senator Preston Brooks of South Carolina, was hailed as a hero in the South and re-elected. A type of black gladiator existed, but as boxers, and not usually fighting for freedom. Still, Virginia slave Tom Molyneux made his owner a fortune boxing and later emancipated himself with $500. Owners often entered strong males in fights but avoided risking valuable property. Slaves were trained to fight for entertainment, and there is evidence that the owners encouraged slaves to scrap with each other in less formal surroundings. They pit slaves against slaves not just for entertainment, but to prevent solidarity. Frederick Douglass recounted fighting the man hired to break him, writing, "I resolved to fight. The man he fought was called a slave breaker, like when you break in a wild horse." These professional breakers were usually white men, but also sometimes black slaves who had been favored by the owner. Douglass said owners engineered ill will between the slaves, sowing division, ranking some higher than others. The divide and rule strategy again. He said on holidays owners gave slaves alcohol and watched them fight, but Douglass never partook. He understood the important psychological aspects of slavery. Give the men days off, ply them with booze, and make some think that they are more special than others, and there won't be much solidarity. Women faced different horrors. They were regularly assaulted by owners and had no recourse to lodge a complaint. A book described one case where a woman fought back. The traitor died of infection, and she was charged with murder. One enslaved man on a Louisiana plantation recalled white wives tolerating their husbands' abuse of slaves. Young women were forced to procreate to save owners' money. Many were seen as breeders paired with strong males to produce children that would be sold later. From an early age, enslaved children carried water, weeded the fields, fed livestock, and drove cows to pasture. By 7 to 12, they were sent to grueling field labor. Older or injured slaves often spun cotton, cooked, or made clothes. When they died, they were often dumped in an unmarked grave outside of the plantation. Some owners allowed slaves to work on the side, grow gardens, or even earn small bonuses, but these kind masters were rare. Like in Rome, U.S. slavery in the South was a marker of wealth. Only 25 to 30% of white Southern households owned slaves, and just 1%, the elite, owned more than 50. Poor whites, often referred to as waste people and clay eaters in educated circles, had no chance of owning a slave. Most slaves were illiterate. Only 1 to 5% could read, compared to 25 to 30% of poor whites. Laws made teaching black slaves illegal. Frederick Douglass taught himself while in hiding with old newspapers snuck to him by poor whites he'd befriended. Douglass later became a towering writer and orator, proving that slaveholders' fears of educated slaves were justified. Even after abolition, the powerful set poor whites and freed blacks against each other. Douglass wrote, "By encouraging the enmity of the poor laboring white man against the blacks, slaveholders succeeded in making the said white man almost as much a slave as the black slave himself." W.E.B. Du Bois also described this as a divide-and-conquer tactic, later echoed in FBI efforts to sabotage the racial unity called for by the likes of murdered Fred Hampton and Martin Luther King Jr. As Douglass put it to President Andrew Johnson, "They divided both to conquer each." And many years later, the Washington Post reminded Americans of this with an article whose headline went, "How American Oligarchs Created the Concept of Race to Divide and Conquer the Poor." In Rome, slavery wasn't racial at all. Divide and rule, yes, but not over race. By 1860, approximately 4 million enslaved African Americans made up 13% of the U.S. population and 1/3 of the South. Their forced labor powered a booming cotton industry, which at its peak accounted for 50% of all U.S. export earnings. It directly made up an estimated 5 to 10% of the national GDP, and far more indirectly. Their blood and toil were the backbone of elite wealth, state power, and global trade. And slavery isn't gone. Today, an estimated 38 to 50 million people remain in forced labor worldwide. Chattel slavery is illegal, but across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, practices still exist that look disturbingly like slavery of the past. Not to mention the millions illegally trafficked almost the world over, including to the USA and other highly developed nations. Before they ever reached the plantations, countless captives endured a harrowing voyage. Watch Life on a Slave Ship to see the brutal reality of that journey, or click on this video instead.